Have you ever stopped, maybe paused for a second, to consider how much our view of the world, how we connect with stories from faraway places, how we absorb ideas, even feel emotions from cultures totally different from our own? How much of that is shaped by language?
It really is quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing the way words don't just pass on information, but they actually build these bridges, not just across countries, but across time too, across centuries of experience.
It feels almost like a kind of magic, really. Language isn't just sounds or symbols on a page. It's the very container for culture, for memory, for who we are. And when we talk about translations, especially literary translation, well, we're not just talking about some technical word swapping.
Right.
It's much deeper. It's this profound act of um, transferring a whole world, its textures, its nuances, its heartbeat from one mind, one culture to another. It's about crossing these huge linguistic and cultural divides.
And that's exactly what we want to do in this deep dive. We want to pull back the curtain on this really fascinating, often incredibly complicated, and let's be honest, sometimes pretty underappreciated world of literary translation.
Definitely underappreciated.
We're going to explore what it really takes to, bring a book to life in another language.
Yeah.
We'll get into the artistic decisions behind every single word choice, the subtle cultural things you have to navigate, and even the ethical tightropes translators walk. And we'll highlight some of the amazing people doing this work.
Yeah. And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a mix of sources. We've got insights straight from literary translators talking about their own work, academic papers digging into the tricky bits like translating poetry or the ethics involved. And we've even looked at historical accounts of big translation movements that literally reshaped cultures. So our aim is really to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding all that invisible work that goes into the books you read and love. We want to show you how every sentence, every phrase you read in translation was chosen, shaped, transformed.
Okay, so let's unpack that word, translation. When we say that, what are we really talking about? Because like you said, it's obviously way more than just looking up words in a dictionary, isn't it? It feels bigger.
Oh, absolutely. Way bigger. The word itself, translation, its history gives us a big clue. It comes from the Latin translatio, which means bringing across or transferring.
Bringing across, I like that.
Yeah, it's not just swapping linguistic coins, word for word. It's a deep act of transfer. You're moving not just the words, but the meaning, the feeling, the whole cultural background that gives a text its soul. It's almost like trying to move a living thing, a delicate plant maybe, from one garden to another and making sure it can actually thrive there.
And that act, that bringing across, it clearly needs a very particular kind of person. It's not enough just to speak two languages fluently, is it? I remember reading the linguist Mario Pei, who said, getting good at translation is pretty much a lifetime job.
You really hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, he thought it was a huge mistake to think just because you're fluent, you can translate well. There's got to be more to it.
So much more. The depth you need goes way beyond just, chatting easily in two languages. A really good translator isn't just bilingual. They have to be, in a very real sense, bicultural.
Bicultural, okay.
They need this deep, almost intuitive grasp of the subtleties, the hidden meanings, the whole web of cultural references baked into both languages. They need to get not just what's said, but what's implied, what's felt. Emily Wilson, the amazing translator of Homer.
Yes. Her Odyssey is fantastic.
Exactly. She has this great analogy. She says translators have to read and write at the same time, as if always playing multiple instruments in a one-person band.
Wow. One-person band. That's quite an image.
Isn't it? It perfectly captures the sheer mental juggling act required. The precision, the creativity, the constant switching between analysis and creation. It's incredibly demanding intellectually, emotionally, artistically.
That one-person band thing really sticks with you. It highlights the huge effort involved. And speaking of huge challenges, Umberto Eco, the brilliant writer and thinker, he once called translation the art of failure. It sounds a bit depressing at first.
Yeah, it does sound a bit grim.
But it makes a particular kind of sense when you think about translating poetry, doesn't it? Is it really like a doomed effort from the start?
Well, maybe not doomed in a hopeless way, but it's definitely a recognition of the inherent difficulty. Poetry is sort of uniquely challenging, much more so than maybe prose or nonfiction. Someone, Widdowson, a linguist, pointed out it's because of the patterning of sound and sense into a single meaning.
Ah, sound and sense together.
Exactly. In poetry, the way it sounds, the rhythm, the rhyme, the music of the words, even how it looks on the page, it's all tangled up with the meaning. It is the meaning, in a way. So
Yeah.
trying to move that whole intricate thing into another language, you often have to make sacrifices. You have to accept that a perfect copy is pretty much impossible. It's more about finding the best possible approximation, maybe.
And a massive part of that difficulty, the thing that causes so much um, turbulence in translation, must be metaphor. Metaphors are just everywhere, aren't they? Not just in fancy poetry, but in news articles, legal stuff, even science. And they're tricky because they're indirect.
That's so true. Metaphor isn't just like decoration for language. It's fundamental to how we think, how we understand the world. Linguists like Lakoff and Johnson showed our whole way of thinking is built on metaphors.
Hmm.
And the really wild thing is metaphors don't just point out similarities that already exist. Sometimes they actually create similarity.
Or make them. How so?
Well, they connect things in new ways. They make us see things differently. So for a translator, the big question isn't just how do I translate this comparison? It's more like how can I adapt or even change this metaphor so it creates a similar kind of connection, a similar impact in the new language. It's actually a very creative act, reinventing almost.
Yeah. Let's maybe look at a concrete example that might help make it clearer. We've got some lines here from an Arabic poem, Rain Song, by Bader Shakir al-Sayyab. The original Arabic apparently has this really delicate layering of images and sounds, things that resonate deeply in that culture.
Right.
And when you look at the English translation, you can see the translator worked incredibly hard to keep those connections, but inevitably some things shift.
Okay, so the original Arabic lines, I'll read a bit here.
Ew. Ooh, it translates roughly to something about eyes, like palm groves at dawn, or balconies the moon leaves behind.
And then the English version goes, your eyes are two palm tree forests in early light, or two balconies from which the moonlight recedes. And it continues, and it continues. When they smile, your eyes, the vines put forth their leaves, and it continues. And lights dance like moons in a river, and it continues. Rippled by the blade of an oar at break of day, and it continues, as if stars were throbbing in the depths of them. Yet what strikes you right away is how the translator tried to capture that really rich visual, that sensory feeling.
Yeah.
The palm tree forests, the balconies, the vines leafing out when the eyes smile, the dancing lights like moons. It's all very vivid, very powerful.
Definitely.
But the internal music of the Arabic, the specific sounds, the rhythm, the deep cultural echoes, trying to replicate all of that exactly in English without losing something else, it would be incredibly hard. Maybe impossible.
So the translator has to aim for the effect, the emotional truth.
Precisely. The effect, the emotional truth, even if the exact patterning of sound and sense, as Widdowson put it, has to be tweaked or reimagined. And this is where that idea of cultural difference, what academics call heterogeneity, really comes into play.
Because it's so much more than just the words. It's the whole world those words live in.
Yeah.
Different languages aren't just different labels for the same things. They embody different cultures, different ways of seeing. And that cultural frame shapes everything, right? Like which books even get picked for translation.
Absolutely everything. And what the translation is supposed to do in its new cultural home. The translator, you see, isn't some neutral machine. Their own background, their beliefs, their expertise, their position in the world, it all influences the work.
How so?
Well, say a translator feels really strongly about keeping the foreignness of the original, their translation might use more expressions that feel a bit, well, foreign in the target language. It keeps that sense of otherness.
Okay, preserving the origin.
Right. But if they lean more towards making it feel totally natural for the new readers, the text might take on more of a local flavor. It becomes easier to read, more familiar maybe. Which leads to a really interesting question for you listening. How much of that original otherness should stay? Should a translated book feel like it came from somewhere else, or should it feel like it was written right here, right now in your language?
Yeah, that's a tough one. No easy answer.
No single right answer at all. It's a constant negotiation, a real balancing act.
And that tension, that balancing act, it leads us straight into thinking about the translator's, well, their invisible hand, I guess, the ethics involved, the unavoidable subjectivity, how their own identity shapes the final text. You often hear about this core dilemma, fidelity versus transparency.
Ah, yes, the classic conflict. It's fundamental in translation studies. Fidelity is all about being faithful, right? Accurately rendering the original meaning, sticking closely to the source text's words and structure, like trying to copy a painting exactly, brushstroke for brushstroke, even if some strokes look a bit strange in the new frame.
Sticking close to the original.
Exactly. And then transparency is the opposite impulse. It's about making the translation sound completely natural, as if it were first written in the target language, making it flow perfectly,
Yeah.
fit the grammar, the idioms, everything.
Making it readable, essentially.
Making it seamless.
Yeah.
There's this famous old phrase from 17th century France, les belles infidèles, the beautiful unfaithful ones. It was used to describe translations that were elegant and lovely to read in French, but maybe took some liberties with the original.
Beautiful, but unfaithful. That sums it up perfectly.
It really does. It captures that enduring puzzle. Can a translation be totally faithful and beautifully transparent? Often it seems translators have to lean one way or the other. They have to make a choice.
So how do they actually make that choice in practice? I imagine it depends hugely on the type of text, right? Like for the Bible or maybe a historical document, you'd probably want to be super literal.
That's often the case, yes. For religious texts or important historical records, translators might go for what's called formal equivalence or metaphrase. The main goal there is to preserve the exact wording and structure. Even if it sounds a bit stiff or unnatural in English, for example, you want the reader to be able to almost reconstruct the original.
Okay, so that's prioritizing fidelity. What about, say, a modern novel?
For broader appeal, especially with fiction, translators often prioritize getting the essential ideas, the emotions, the overall impact across. That's more dynamic or functional equivalence, closer to a paraphrase maybe. It's about capturing the feeling, making sure it hits home for the new audience, even if you have to use different words or structures to get that feeling across.
So adapting it more for the reader.
Exactly. And then you have thinkers like Lawrence Venuti, who argue for something else entirely: foreignizing translations.
Foreignizing. What's that?
It's a deliberate strategy to make the translation feel a bit foreign, to resist smoothing everything out. The idea is to constantly remind the reader, hey, you're reading something from another culture, another place. It challenges that tendency to make everything sound like it originated right here.
That's interesting. So it makes the translator's work and the original's difference more visible.
Precisely. And that choice, fidelity, transparency, foreignizing, it's never made in a vacuum. It connects deeply to the translator's own ideology, their background, their beliefs, their values. It all subtly shapes every decision, starting with the very first one. Which book do I even choose to translate?
And those beliefs can really reshape a text, can't they? I'm thinking of that famous example, Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar al-Khayyam.
Oh, absolutely. A classic case. Fitzgerald's 1859 translation was hugely popular in the West, practically defined Omar Khayyam for generations of English readers.
Right, everyone knew it, or thought they did.
Exactly. But scholars who work with the original Persian point out that Fitzgerald's version is, well, it's very much Fitzgerald's version. He took huge liberties. He created something that reflected his own Victorian tastes and concerns.
So it wasn't really Khayyam.
It wasn't the Khayyam known in Persian literature, who was this complex figure, a scientist, a philosopher, representing a kind of vigorous, joyous, and reasonable lifestyle. Fitzgerald's translation foregrounded the wine, women, and song aspect, shaping this very specific, somewhat hedonistic image in the West. Some scholars even say many of Fitzgerald's famous quatrains don't even match any specific original verse.
Wow, so the translator's ideology completely created the Western perception of this author. That really shows the power they wield, doesn't it? It makes you wonder what else we've read that's been filtered like that.
It's sobering thought, and it raises a huge ethical question. Given this inherent subjectivity, how do we ensure translation is done responsibly? How do we balance the translator's necessary interpretation with respect for the author and the reader?
Is there a framework for that?
Well, some interesting ideas come from Chinese philosophy, actually. Concepts like harmony and diversity, seeking common ground while reserving differences, and just basic honesty. This approach tries to find a way to acknowledge the translator's role, but keep their subjectivity in check, fostering respect and cooperation between everyone involved, author, translator, reader. It's about finding that ethical balance.
And that need for respectful cooperation, that ethical balance, it must get even trickier, maybe more intense, when you're dealing with issues like race, identity, and language that might be seen as problematic today.
Definitely. Take a novel like Iggy Abasego's Beyond Babylon. The translation, done by someone unnamed in Detroit, dives right into really complex questions of identity. The main character, Mar, uses phrases like fruit of the third world or calls herself a semi-negress. These are terms that immediately flag a complicated negotiation of heritage.
Right. The character herself is constantly asking, am I black? Somali Italian, Italo Somali, Afro Italian.
Exactly. Sego's novel doesn't try to smooth over that ambiguity. It embraces it.
Yeah.
It shows it as maybe confusing but also liberating. And the plot itself, Mars' journey across different countries, kind of mirrors the act of translation, not just of language, but of identity. How do you carry who you are across borders?
It makes me think of James Baldwin moving to France, bringing his perspective on Blackness to a different context. Sego seems to expand that even further, looking at Black identity in Italy, Argentina, Somalia, Tunisia, places maybe not typically centered in U.S. discussions.
Yes, it really underscores what one source called the inexhaustibility of that question. How do you transport who you are across boundaries? Sego explores it from so many angles, making it a truly global look at identity.
And translators today are right in the middle of navigating how contemporary social discussions affect language choices.
Okay.
Julia Sanchez, who translates from Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, she shared an interesting story. She was co-translating a book, and they came across a metaphor they felt was, in her words, gratuitously colorist. Like, it used race-based language in a way that seemed offensive and, importantly, added nothing to the text.
So what do they do?
After a lot of thought, they decided to remove it, which immediately brings up that difficult question. What do you do with language in an older text, or even a contemporary one, that clashes with current sensibilities in the target culture? Especially when conversations about race or gender might be happening differently in different parts of the world.
That's a huge challenge. Like Sanchez mentioned how the very active discussions about race in the U.S. are now influencing conversations in Brazil, which historically had this problematic idea of being a racial democracy.
Right. So the translator is navigating not just language, but these evolving social currents. It's a really delicate ethical dance, isn't it? Trying to be respectful to the new audience and faithful to the original intent.
It absolutely is. It shows translation is so much more than finding equivalent words. It's about mediating between cultures, between different moments in time even.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving from the individual translator's choices to the world they work in. There's this common image, isn't there? The translator locked away alone in an ivory tower or maybe a monastic cell.
Yes, the ebony tower or the desert island trope. Surrounded by dictionaries and cold coffee.
The lonely genius trope? But you're saying that's not the whole picture.
Not at all. While yes, the actual act of translating requires intense focus and solitude, the community aspect is absolutely crucial. Step into any good translation workshop or course, and that myth just shatters. You find rooms buzzing with energy, full of friendly, talkative people, sharp, funny, brilliant ideas flying around.
What unites them?
Their shared love for literature, obviously, but also this common mission. Helping great books travel, helping them cross borders. It's a very collaborative spirit, actually.
So what do these workshops look like? You mentioned different kinds.
Yeah, there's some fascinating formats. One is the multilingual translation workshop, sometimes called a translator's hive.
A hive, okay.
Imagine translators working from maybe Japanese, German, Arabic, all different languages, but they all translate into the same target language, say English. And the really cool part, they critique and comment on each other's work without knowing the original language.
How does that even work?
Surprisingly well. Someone translating from Japanese might spot, say, a sentence structure in the German to English translation that still feels a bit German. Or they might just see a better way to phrase something in English, offering a fresh perspective outside the specific source target pair. It really helps people learn to self-edit, to see their own work more clearly before an editor even sees it.
That sounds incredibly useful, getting feedback from outside your usual language bubble.
It really is. Though keeping those multilingual discussions focused can be tricky. The ideas get so exciting, it's easy to go off on tangents.
I can imagine. So you need a good moderator.
Definitely. Then you have more focused workshops. Language pair ones, where everyone works in the same combination, like French to Bulgarian, and vice versa workshops, which are really powerful. Yeah, they bring together translators working in both directions of a language pair. So Polish to German translators work alongside German to Polish translators.
Ah, okay. That sounds like the perfect setup for really getting into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. You get super qualified feedback, help deciphering really tough passages, and you start to think in the other direction. It makes you more aware of the nuances in both languages, including your own mother tongue. Plus, they're amazing for building lasting relationships with colleagues from the source language country. That network is invaluable.
So it builds community across borders, too.
For sure. Another common method is consensus translation. A whole team works together, maybe on a single poem or short story, debating every word choice, analyzing the author's intent, the cultural context, the style, until they reach a collective agreement on the final translation. It's like collaborative detective work.
And then the ultimate collaboration working with the author. Does that happen often?
It can. Günter Grass, the German Nobel laureate, used to do this. After publishing a new book, he'd invite all his translators to a workshop. They'd go through the text page by page, sometimes for days.
Wow. Direct access.
Imagine. They could ask him directly about tricky passages, obscure references, cultural nuances. He could explain his intentions. It was hugely beneficial for everyone. Plus, apparently, often quite funny, seeing all the cultural differences emerge in the room.
I bet. That must have been an incredible experience for the translators.
Absolutely. And that connection to the act of writing itself is why things like creative writing for translators workshops are becoming more important.
Why is that? Translators are already writers, aren't they?
They are incredibly skilled writers, yes. But doing their own original creative writing, poems, stories, whatever, lets them experience building a world from scratch, making those fundamental authorial choices. It helps them understand the writer's perspective from the inside out, rather than always responding to an existing text. It strengthens their own creative muscles.
That makes sense. Okay, so beyond the craft itself, what about the business side, the industry?
Yes. The less glamorous, but absolutely essential part. Contracts, for example. Many translators, especially when they're starting out, just don't realize they can and should negotiate their contracts, or that they have intellectual property rights, just like authors.
Really? That seems like a big gap.
It is, and it raises a big question for the publishing industry. How do we better empower translators? Ensure they get fair pay, fair recognition for work that is absolutely essential to bringing books to a wider audience.
So workshops might cover things like contracts and rights.
Good ones do. They also cover practical things like applying for grants and residencies. Because, here's a little secret, translators often end up writing the grant applications for the publishers who hire them.
Seriously, that sounds like a lot of extra work.
It can be. So learning how to write a winning grant proposal is a vital skill. And just getting a better understanding of the publishing world, how books get chosen, how they're marketed, that can make a huge difference for a translator's career, helping them navigate the industry.
You mentioned a pitching simulation. That sounds fun.
It is, and incredibly useful. Translators pick a book they love, one they really want to see translated, and prepare a short, sharp pitch like 5 or 7 minutes. Then they present it to actual publishers invited to the workshop.
Do publishers ever actually bait?
Sometimes, yes. It's amazing. These practice pitches have actually led to real book deals. It gives translators a direct line to the decision makers and turns a learning exercise into a potential career boost.
That's fantastic. So the community aspect doesn't end with the workshop.
Not at all. Building and maintaining that network is key. Alumni groups, often online like on Facebook or private forums, are vital. They keep the conversation going, share resources, job opportunities, and even help each other with really tricky translation problems, like a collective brain trust.
A translator hive mind.
Kind of. And it's not just online. These groups often organize live meetups, maybe informal things like walks or museum visits, always ending with coffee and discussion, of course. Some even hold mini conferences showcasing translations published by alumni. It celebrates their work and helps attract new people to future workshops. It really paints a picture of a vibrant, connected community, totally busting that myth of the lonely translator.
It's a much richer picture. Okay, let's zoom out even further now and take a journey through time. How has translation shaped history, and how has history shaped translation? Where do we start? Ancient roots.
Let's start way back with one of the most important early Western translations, the Septuagint.
The Greek Old Testament. Right?
Exactly. A massive translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, done between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. Why? Because Jewish communities living outside Judea, scattered around the Mediterranean, were starting to forget Hebrew. They needed the scriptures in Greek, the common language of the time, to keep their faith and traditions alive. A powerful example of translation driven by community need.
And then in medieval Europe, Latin was king, wasn't it?
Latin was the lingua franca, yes, for scholarship, church, diplomacy. The church was pretty protective of St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate Bible. But you did see some early moves toward translating into local languages. Alfred the Great in 9th century England was amazing. He actually commissioned translations of important works into Anglo-Saxon, into Old English, to educate his people.
Ahead of his time.
Totally. Meanwhile, over in Asia, The spread of Buddhism fueled huge, centuries-long translation projects. Think about the Tangut Empire in Central Asia. They used block printing, got full government backing. The emperor himself apparently helped out. They translated Buddhist scriptures incredibly efficiently, much faster than it had taken in China earlier.
So translation was seen as strategically important.
Hugely important. A nation-building tool, even. Back in the West, looking at English specifically, Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century was key. He basically founded English poetry partly through translating adapting works from Italian and French Boccaccio, the Roman de la Rose. He wasn't just copying, he was shaping the English language for literature.
And later, in the Tudor period, people like Tyndale with the New Testament.
Exactly. Tyndale's translation had a massive impact on English. And you saw others translating chronicles and classics. The ideal started shifting towards matching the original style, making it sound elegant in English, but often the underlying idea was still about making it sound like the original author would have written if they'd been English.
Which led to some interesting results with poets like Dryden and Pope translating Virgil and Homer.
Yes, Dryden wanted Virgil to speak as an Englishman. The result is great English poetry, but maybe more Dryden than Virgil. Same with Pope's Homer, a brilliant English epic, but perhaps not quite capturing the feel of the original Greek. They prioritized making it work powerfully in English, sometimes over strict fidelity.
So they assimilated the texts.
In a way, yes. But then the 19th century saw a big swing back towards accuracy. The motto became the text, the whole text, and nothing but the text. Lots of footnotes.
Except maybe the naughty bits.
Yes, those often got quietly skipped. And Victorians sometimes used this very literal style, almost pseudo-metaphrase, to constantly remind you you're reading a foreign book. It could feel quite stiff.
But Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat was different.
Totally different. That was the big exception in 1859. Its Oriental feel came more from clever stylistic choices, Persian names, biblical echoes, than from actually translating Khayyam, literally. It was more of a brilliant adaptation. But the real shift towards modern accuracy arguably came later, with Benjamin Jowett's straightforward Plato translation in 1871. That set a new standard.
Fascinating shifts. Now, what about East Asia? You mentioned classical Chinese poetry having untranslatable features.
Oh yes, Perry Link, the sinologist, wrote about translating Wang Wei, a Tang dynasty poet. Some things are just incredibly difficult to bring across. Like the visual aspect, classical Chinese characters in a 5-character line form a neat rectangle. How do you replicate that visual beauty in English with its varying word lengths?
You can't.
Without making it look very strange. And then there's the sound complex patterns of tones that create music and meaning. Very hard to echo in English.
And the grammar, you said it was ambiguous.
Highly ambiguous. Characters often don't specify a subject. I, he, number, singular, plural, or tense, past, present. Link gives the example. If you translate a line and add an I where the Chinese has no subject, you immediately make it personal and specific, potentially losing the universal, timeless feeling of the original. So the translator faces this puzzle. How do you translate absence? How do you convey meaning that comes from not saying something explicitly?
That's a mind bender.
It really is. It forces translators into making really tough choices that go to the heart of the poem's meaning. Now, shifting again, the Islamic world also had a massive translation movement.
Starting with practical things, like diplomacy.
Right, after the 5th century CE, translating treaties, letters. But it quickly exploded into translating Greek philosophy, Persian literature, Indian science, huge scholarly efforts in centers like Baghdad's House of Wisdom or universities in Fez, Cairo, a real golden age of knowledge transfer.
And then another big wave in the 19th century, led by this Egyptian cleric.
Rifa al-Tatawi, a pivotal figure. He spent years in Paris, came back, and launched this massive government-backed project to translate maybe 2,000 European and Turkish books into Arabic.
2,000? What kinds of books?
Everything. Ancient geography, Voltaire, French military manuals, even the Napoleonic Code and the Marseillaise. An incredible range.
What was the impact of all that?
It fundamentally changed. The Arabic and Ottoman Turkish languages pushed them towards simpler syntax, more directness. And crucially, it brought in a flood of new ideas, Enlightenment thought, science, concepts like Darwinism, Darwinia. For a while, it massively expanded what counted as legitimate knowledge beyond just religious texts, fueling liberal movements.
But that didn't last.
Sadly, no. Later political changes, especially after World War I, saw illiberal forces gain ground, often pushing back against that openness. But the translation movement itself was transformative.
Which brings us right up to today and the future. Technology is obviously a huge factor now. We hear about SAT tools, computer-assisted translation. That's not machines doing it all, right?
Correct. SAT tools are assistants for human translators. Think of them as really smart software helpers. They do things like build translation memories, databases of previously translated sentences or phrases, which helps maintain consistency on big projects and saves time.
So they handle repetitive stuff.
Exactly. And terminology management, keeping track of specific technical terms or brand names. They basically streamline the more mechanical bits, letting the human focus on the trickier parts.
Okay, and then there's machine translation, MT. That is the computer doing the translation.
That's the goal, yes. Automated translation. But even the best MT still usually needs humans involved, often pre-editing the original text to make it clearer for the machine, and almost always post-editing the machine's output to fix errors and make it sound natural.
And here's the interesting bit you mentioned. MT automates the easier parts.
Largely, yes. The more predictable word swapping, the basic sentence structures. Which means the human translator is left with the really hard stuff, resolving ambiguity, capturing nuance, making culturally sensitive choices, injecting style and voice, the most time-consuming and cognitively demanding parts.
Because human language is just so context-dependent.
Totally. Relying just on raw machine output is risky because language only makes sense in context. And understanding context, really getting it, requires human intelligence, world knowledge, intuition. The psychologist Gary Marcus pointed out that pretty much every sentence we say is ambiguous in some way.
Our brains just sort it out instantly.
Right. We do it without thinking. Machines really struggle with that. There's a classic AI problem called the pronoun disambiguation problem, or PDP.
Okay.
It's hard for machines to tell what pronouns like it or they refer to in a sentence, especially cross sentences. Does it refer to the book, the car, the idea just mentioned? Humans know instinctively, usually. Machines often guess wrong. The inability to handle ambiguity is a huge barrier.
So the human translator's main job becomes dealing with ambiguity.
That's a huge part of it. Conducting research to figure out ambiguities, understanding subtle shades of meaning, grasping cultural references, making creative choices to convey the art of the text. That's what humans do uniquely well. That's why, for publishable quality, especially in literature, the human translator is still absolutely essential.
So the future isn't necessarily human versus machine, but maybe human plus machine.
Exactly. Technology can help with efficiency, but the core artistry, the deep understanding, the ethical judgment that remains firmly in human hands, the human touch is still paramount for making sure books truly connect across cultures.
What an incredible journey we've taken today. We've really dived deep into this complex, often invisible, but truly vital world of literary translation.
We really have. We've seen it's this amazing mix of language skill, cultural immersion, ethical decision-making, community support, all playing out against this backdrop of history and changing technology.
We looked at the challenges of just bridging worlds, that invisible hand of the translator's own perspective, the importance of workshops and networks, and how translation has shaped and been shaped by cultures across time.
From the Septuagint to AI, from Chinese poetry to Arabic philosophy, from Fitzgerald's Khayyam to collaborative workshops. It's a huge field.
So as we finish up, here's maybe one last thought for you, the listener, to take away and chew on. We've talked a lot about the ambiguities in language, the deep cultural knowledge needed for translation. Could it be that engaging with translated literature doesn't just open windows onto other cultures, but maybe it also makes us question our own assumptions about meaning, even in texts written in our own language?
That's a fascinating idea.
Right. What if we start seeing every text, even one written in our mother tongue, as a kind of translation itself, a translation of thoughts, feelings, experiences into the imperfect medium of words, always open to interpretation, always carrying hidden layers? What new meanings might we find if we approach everything we read with that translator's mindset?